You're listening to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast, the show with a light-hearted look at the eventing world, all of the big event previews, reviews, and special guests, and of course, backed up with all of the key Echo Ratings stats. Welcome to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast. Welcome to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast and something a little bit different for you listeners. So we have got a slightly longer show in store, but it is one that we really hope you'll enjoy. It is the story of Atlanta, 1996, 25 years ago, the big Olympics in Atlanta, which we are going to talk about in a lot more detail over the next couple of hours. And I have got two excellent co-hosts for the show. Let's start by introducing them. Dan Byrne and Catherine Austin. Dee, I'm going to come to you first because let's talk about why we wanted to go and look back on Atlanta and its significance to talk about it now.
Oh, I mean, there's a whole range of reasons, Nicole. I suppose the first reason that had been coming up for myself and yourself quite a lot was that people have just been casually dropping it into conversation in reference to Tokyo. I suppose there are some shared conditions, perhaps. There was a format change back then. There's going to be a format change in Tokyo. Every so often, and actually more often than not, I hear Atlanta 1996 referenced while people are talking about Tokyo. And I thought, well, for people like me who don't really remember that much about Atlanta 1996, it would be quite useful to dig into it a little bit more. And also, I think, as you guys have found with the excellent Hall of Fame series that you've been doing, I think it's really important just to remember this stuff and record it and have it there and tell the story. Spreading the historical knowledge of the sport. I mean, we have access to such incredible people who all have such great stories to tell that it almost would just feel remiss of us, Nicole, not to tell the story of Atlanta 96. It is 25 years ago. It is an incredible story, and it's one that is now recorded for the record books. So lots of reasons to do it, and yeah, delighted that it's done.
Yeah, it's one I've really enjoyed actually, because I didn't know anything about Atlanta really coming into it. I'd obviously heard about it and sort of knew the vague details, but didn't really know much more than that. And so it's been fascinating to kind of dig a little bit deeper beneath the surface. Catherine, let's set the scene because Dee has already alluded to a format change. Just kind of give us an overview as to what was so significant about Atlanta and the build up to it, but also what happened there.
Atlanta was the Olympics following the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, which had been conducted in very hot conditions. And a lot of horses had struggled with the heat in Barcelona. And there was a real determination on the part of the FEI and the equestrian community that this shouldn't happen again. And that's one of the main reasons why I think Atlanta is so significant. And therefore, a huge amount of research and thinking went into how things could be done better. And the information that was discovered and learnt and the things that were put into practice have changed the sport and will be very relevant in Tokyo, have been extremely relevant since, have spread far beyond eventing, beyond top class eventing, to how we think and treat horses in all forms of competition and in work. And I think that's really a very significant thing. So there was a lot of build-up, a lot of very public build-up. It was taking place in America, a very well-established eventing nation, high expectations, and it was a very successful Olympics. And the crop of riders who, in some ways, people of our generation idealised were very involved, which is always A, interesting, and B, means that it has a lot of relevance to us, I think. There were two competitions. There was a team competition and a separate individual competition. The team competition ran first and was won rather marvellously by the Australians again. We will hear from Wendy Schaeffer, who actually, in inverted commas, won the team competition, i.e. she finished first, and yet obviously didn't receive an individual medal because they were separate. The United States finished second on their home turf, and the mighty New Zealanders finished in the bronze medal position. Individually, Blyth Tait won on a horse that we've talked about lots of times, the absolutely incredible Ready Teddy. What a horse to go on and win a world championships as well. Sally Clark from New Zealand took the silver medal, and Kerry Milliken from the USA took the bronze medal. Interestingly, neither the British nor the Irish had a particularly good time, and we'll hear more about that. And I think that I learned so much from listening to our guests today. I knew some things about Atlanta, but particularly from Hugh Thomas, who was the technical delegate out there, and from David Marlin, who was in charge or, well, heavily involved in the veterinary projects. I learned things that I think will actually really stay with me and improve my knowledge of the sport from now on, which is something that's always quite cool.
Yeah, agree completely. And there is so much, as we've said, that I think it has shaped the sport moving forwards, and people will hopefully come away from this show, listeners, having learned something and having enjoyed a trip down memory lane as we talk about and to people that have been in the sport for a very long time. So we're going to get into it. I will introduce you to each of our guests before we get started. Hugh Thomas, who is the technical delegate that Catherine has already mentioned, Dr. David Marlin, who is heavily involved in the research, building up to the games in particular and making sure that everything was as safe as possible and it was a successful games. We have Kate Green, who was a journalist covering those games for Eventing magazine. Wendy Schaeffer Macdonald, who was part of that Australian team who took the team gold. She was only 21 when she went to Atlanta, her first Olympic Games. And finally, the individual gold medalist, the Olympic champion Blyth Tait, will be our last guest on the show. So here it is, the story of Atlanta 1996. We hope you enjoy.
So first up on the show, I'm delighted to be joined by Hugh Thomas. Now, Hugh, you have the unenviable role in this case of being first, which requires all of the context setting for Atlanta 1996. Let's go back to the very, very start. So the games were awarded to Atlanta. What are you thinking? Do you know your role yet, or where does the journey begin for you?
Well, the games are always awarded, or nearly always awarded, 5 years beforehand. So it must have been, I guess, 1991. And I got a phone call from the FEI saying the games are going to Atlanta. They need somebody to go out and help them choose a site for the equestrian events. Because in those days, there was some site in the bid, but the bids weren't very well scrutinised. What really happened in those days was when a city got awarded the games, they then ran around saying, oh my God, we've been awarded this, how the hell are we going to run it? And where are we going to run it? And so I was appointed earlier than usual as technical delegate, of course, for the 3-day event, but in practice as the overall technical delegate for the years of preparation. And I went out to Atlanta within a few weeks and met all the organising team and was taken on a helicopter ride around the state of Georgia, visiting different potential sites to say whether any of them were acceptable from the FEI point of view as being suitable for the equestrian events. And from memory, I think we came up with 2 that were. None of them had existing equestrian facilities at all. So my job was to sort of certify that they would be all right. And then the organising committee, the United States, the Atlanta organising committee, I should say, eventually chose the Georgia International Horse Park as the venue. But that was quite an exciting time when it really was a blank canvas, to put it mildly.
How quickly do things move then? I mean, what I'm interested here is we've probably, I mean, in my time, which as you know is much more recent in the sport, I suppose you see games like London where there was
from an eventing point of view, there was huge excitement because of, I suppose, the home of eventing being Britain. And then you've got the Rio Olympics, where we had, I suppose it felt like the paint was still wet, but it got done, and there was this kind of party atmosphere, which makes it. Tokyo, which felt in that kind of 4 years preceding, where it was all about how organized it was and how ready it was. What was the general feeling in that period leading up to Atlanta, from how ready it is, how exciting it is? I think the US probably would have definitely been still in close to their period of dominance in the sport. Was there that feeling of, I suppose, equestrian sports in the US being ready and excited? What was that atmosphere feeling like?
No, the US certainly in eventing were not at the top of the tree at the time, although they were there or thereabouts. There was definitely an air of excitement in the area. Particularly, I can only really focus on Atlanta and Georgia because that's where all my time was spent, and you really felt it was a Georgia Olympic Games, not an American Olympic Games. There was a great deal of pride in the state, first state in the South, the old South America, to hold an Olympic Games. A degree of rivalry with Los Angeles, which had been back in 1984, and anything they can do, we can do better. Certainly on the equestrian side of things, there was excitement about the creation of a completely new equestrian facility, the Georgia International Horse Park, which is where the games were eventually held, which was intended to be a facility for all equestrianism, not just for the Olympic disciplines. And lots of American equestrianism is not part of Olympic disciplines, but they were all going to have a home in the Georgia International Horse Park. So the creation of that park and the design of it, which started sort of straight away, and all the design work, obviously the design of the cross-country course and things like that, but the design of the facilities had to go, the arenas and the barns for the stables and the practice rings and everything. It had to start from scratch on a bit of virgin land. And it was great fun to see that take shape. I think there was always great confidence that it would all be ready. There were ups and downs, but they hired good people, sensible people. They hired Roger Haller, who was a great friend of mine, sadly no longer with us, as the cross-country course designer, or the eventing course designer, and he was very influential and instrumental in helping with the whole layout of the site and so on. They hired a lady called Tait Jackson, who'd been very involved with the Seoul Olympic Games, to be the main organizer. I can't remember what her title was, but in our terms, she was the organizer, and she and I got on very well, and she was a very efficient person. There was a great focus in those days on getting the footing right, and they hired a guy from Denmark called Herman Dukek, who was the only chap really who knew all about both dressage footing and jumping footing, and was respected all around the world. So they got a core of good people who knew what they were doing. And there was a lot of enthusiasm in the build-up.
What was it like, Hugh? I mean, you've seen it from badminton right up to, recent years, where I suppose communications have changed and ease of access and everything has changed. I presume you had to go to Atlanta reasonably regularly. I mean, even 95, 96, email was still in its infancy, if probably not really being taken up fully. Was it all phone calls? Were you able to fly over and back? What was just the admin side of this like?
I think I went about 3 times a year, from the time I was appointed until the games, pretty much 2 or 3 times every year. Yeah, a certain amount was done remotely, but most of it was on site. Most of it was face-to-face meetings. And of course, in that planning stage, the thing that really fixes in my mind is that very early on, we'd all realized that the biggest potential problem of Atlanta was the weather and the heat and humidity in the South United States in the middle of summer. And that's when and why the research projects got started to see what the effects on the horses might be. There were strong memories of the World Championships in Kentucky, where a lot of horses were very, very sick. And nobody wanted that to happen again, and conditions were likely to be much the same. And so a lot of research was done, mostly in Great Britain, actually, by the Animal Health Trust. Dr. David Marlin and a team from the Animal Health Trust. And I was quite involved in helping them sort of from the lay point of view and helping set the parameters and helping them as to where and who to talk to and where to do their research. We wanted to find out what the effect on the horses might be, how we should best measure the weather, what the parameters of safety, how hot and humid would it be dangerous to run the competition at all? And then the big test that we set was in the likely conditions, how can we replicate the normal demands being made on the horses so that, as it were, to compete in Atlanta in hot and humid, how long should the course be, for instance? The course is, because remember we were in steeplechase and roads and tracks and things in those days. How long should all the courses be so that the horse was tested to much the same extent as he would be around a normal badminton or burley? Now, it was never going to be an exact science, but that was our target. And it had the effect that in the run-up to the games, I mean, literally right up until, I think about 3 months before, it had not been decided exactly how long the courses were going to be. And so Roger Haller, with my advice and help, had to plan lots of different scenarios. And indeed, when we had a test event out there a year before, we actually had 2 different competitions over 2 different parts of the terrain, so that we could be sure we'd used all of the ground we might possibly use when the main thing came along, although in the end we only used about 2/3 of it. And that was a really interesting project, but with quite an anxious making project, because we really didn't want disasters with horses dropping like flies, to put it mildly. Nor did we want to so emasculate the competition that it was no longer a test worthy of an Olympic Games.
It reminds me a little bit of the difficulties which I suppose you face when you are like with all, say, World Equestrian Games or Olympics, where you are always having to take into account the weather. And then, I remember, say, 2014 in France, where probably weren't expecting the rain that we had, and maybe probably weren't set up for that level of rain in Cannes. Then we get to 2018, again, World Equestrian Games, where we had the threat of the hurricanes and just about got to go ahead at Tryon, but there was so much talk in advance, and that balance again having to be made between how we could keep everybody safe, how we could make sure the competition goes ahead, but how we could make sure then that the competition, I suppose, was a worthy test. We literally, I suppose, we got so lucky in Tryon from memory, because I think we came on a day in between 2 kind of extreme weather conditions. As part of your planning, was it ever a potential that the conditions would be so hot that you wouldn't be able to run? Was there ever, I mean, it must have been far out, I guess, as a contingency, but were you ever concerned that it wouldn't go ahead?
We had to have at least a cut-off point, because we had to say, like, what are the likely conditions, monitoring the weather and all the weather patterns for those months over many, many years. And the United States Weather Service had fantastic data that we were able to get hold of. So first of all, we had to find out what the effect of the horses was in order to say, now what would really be unacceptable, i.e., even if you reduce the competition, reduce the length of the course and so on, it would still be too hot or humid. It was never, that was a very remote possibility because the conditions did not indicate that was a likely scenario. But it had to be there. I couldn't possibly tell you what the figures are now. I couldn't remember them. I might have them somewhere. But there was a situation where if it gets to that, we can't run it. And in those circumstances, we did have alternatives like postponing for a day or whatever. We had some things like that built into it. In the end, of course, the weather conditions on the cross-country days were better than the average for the time of year had been for many years. It was much cooler, much easier. And so all of that sort of went out the window. Inevitably, there were some people saying, "Oh, you've shortened it far too much. This is ridiculous." We were always going to be on a loser, whatever the end result was on that. But every contingency, we had to have a plan of some sort for everything.
How, as we get closer then to the games, how early did you have to go over? Before the games, what point did you arrive in the US?
Oh, well, I mean, in terms of the actual games, I probably only arrived a week before, but I'd been there 3 months before, and I'd been there 6 months before, and so on.
Okay.
So, once the show was on the road, my job became relatively, well, mundane is perhaps the wrong word, but much less exciting and much less nerve-wracking once things started. The other thing I'm just going to mention, of course, that was very different about Atlanta was the first time we had to have two separate competitions, an individual competition and a team competition. The International Olympic Committee, after the previous games, after Barcelona, had said you can no longer have just one competition for two medals, individual and team. And so after much angst, I was a member of the FEI eventing committee at the time, we decided to run it as two separate competitions. And that happened in Atlanta and in Sydney. And then after that, it became to the other format where you have a second show jumping, which was marginally more popular. Neither of them was what we wanted as a sport. We wanted what we do very well, which is run the team and individual competition together. So anyway, that had to be planned for. And then that also meant there had to be some differences in the courses between the two competitions. There was yet more variables to bring into it. But it actually worked quite well in the end. The key thing is we got absolutely valid winners in both team and individual competitions, people whose names on the board looked like Olympic champions. And so, so it worked. Didn't like it, but it worked.
You are quite experienced even at this point in your career, and you're on the FEI eventing committee. It's not necessarily that you've seen it all. There was still a huge amount more to come. But I suppose it's a question that you would ask of the athletes, and I'm sure we'll be talking to some of them and asking this exact question on the show. In advance of an Olympic Games, of course, they're going to be nervous. Did you feel any nerves at the time? Is it something that you get used to, or I suppose there is still a big degree of responsibility that comes with essentially organising the games from an eventing point of view, albeit as part of the team. Did you get nervous?
I'll answer that in a different way. Before I took over as director of badminton, I worked for the BBC at equestrian events, and I was interviewing my predecessor, Frank Weldon, and I said, "This may seem a ridiculous question, Colonel, but do you get at all nervous before the cross country?" And he said, "Boy, if I didn't get nervous, I'd give up my job because I've been no good at it." Now, that actually said it all. It's a completely different thing from riding. Of course it is. But if you're not keyed up, if the adrenaline isn't going, if you're not a bit nervous, doesn't mean you can't do your job, but you should be apprehensive. You should be a bit on edge, because that's how that means your heart's in it. That means you feel it. So yes, I certainly was. When you see the first horse set off on the cross country, it particularly is, of course, the key moment for all of us involved in our sport. That first horse on the cross country, very apprehensive.
And I suppose in line with that answer, that never really goes away, I'm sure, like right up to, the recent badmintons. It is still that first horse, isn't it, when you're looking at how this is all going to play out. There's so much outside of your control up until you see that, and at least you get an idea then. I mean, it's the last horse, I'm sure, when some sense of relief comes, but the first horse is a key one right up. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that never goes away.
No, it never goes away. I mean, when you're the event organizer, as opposed to the technical delegate or the course designer, there are a number of other landmarks and so on, which are, of great importance. But the success of the cross-country day, is in the end the thing of most abiding importance about our sport. It is the centerpiece. And so, I used to get at badminton, quite excited about making sure the trade stands are open on time and various other things, but nothing quite compares to the cross-country day.
So we arrived then at Atlanta. We're going to hear from lots of people who were involved, but the competition itself, Hugh, would you say that not pales into insignificance? I think that's probably much too strong, but I suppose your lasting memories of it, would they be focused on the long build-up and the I suppose the legacy of Georgia and getting everyone there and getting this thing to go ahead rather than the competition?
Yes, frankly. I mean, one of the most obvious things from my point of view about all of my non-riding career in eventing, whether as an event director, a course designer, technical delegate, is I often remember almost nothing about the competition. You remember occasional. I remember from many competitions a few brilliant cross-country rounds that will live in my memory. Just, God, that was one of the finest things I'd ever seen. That's how it should be done. Obviously, the occasional disaster when things went badly wrong, you remember. I'm very bad on quizzes when people ask me, who was third at badminton in 19 so and so. I have the faintest idea. I can all look it up and then it comes back, obviously. And looking back, I tend to forget which course was which year or anything like that, because one is so focused on putting it on and the overall picture that the details of the competition one tends to forget. I can remember some things in Atlanta. I remember. You see, the difficulty, I can't absolutely be certain. A rider, I think it was a rider on the American team, but had a fall on the flat out of view of television cameras. It's a sort of nightmare of cross-country controllers when the horse sort of disappears off the map. In those days, that wasn't penalised, but even so, it's very difficult. I remember when the first horse went on the cross-country, the cross-country tracking system that they used in cross-country control, because the Americans were absolutely certain that their totally computerized cross-country control system was the only way to function. So it was all set up. And I think from memory, there were about 26, 27 fences on the cross-country course. And when the first horse was coming up to fence 35 on the computer, General Nanny Grignolo, who's present in the grand jury that day, said to Giles Rousel, "Where is your board?" And now Giles went to his car, pulled out the board that he'd bought for exactly this eventuality, and we went back to putting pegs in the board because the computers, of course, weren't properly programmed and didn't work. I remember that very, very well. I remember having my car, my loan car, I'd left the keys in it by the steeplechase and somebody else took it and drove it away and I was left stranded. So there were all sorts of funny little incidents like that. I'm going to tell you one more little vignette because it's a very, very unusual one in the build-up. I was out there, and this is just a couple of years before, actually, and we met all the people who were setting up the medical services. And they started talking about having to do all the, what I think generically were always called sex tests to determine whether an athlete was a man or a woman. And I said, why are we doing that in equestrian sport? And they said, we'll do it in every sport, it's the rules. I said, well, it seems a bit stupid, waste of everybody's time and money, because we don't care what the result is. Unlike women's discus or men's 1500 meters, we don't care what the result is. This is a sport where men and women compete against each other. We're gender neutral, whatever you care to call it. And to my great surprise, I can claim to have abolished sex testing in equestrian sport. Because they went away and said, oh, you're quite right. We don't need that, do we? So there we are. Put that on my record.
A legacy. Good man. Good man. Last question, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions on the details of the competition itself and on the, as you say, the worthy winners and the legacy and the first time we had a different format or a slightly different format, and there was many more format changes to come. And I suppose we're going to see a new format change at Tokyo. We're going to see similar conditions, we think, and there'll be lots of, I suppose, similar planning that you would have gone through then. What I'm always interested in that behind the scenes moment is where were you watching it all? You know, where, just at a very basic level, where do you stand and are you moving around and how's your communication? All those kind of, that little piece of, say, particularly cross country day, where did you actually watch it and did you get to move around?
Yes, I think I did actually. Generally, when I was a technical delegate at major championships, I generally did. I used to normally start the day in cross country control, and then go out with, of course, radio communications, so available to go and look into any incidents, but go out and see it. See it actually on the ground, and I certainly did do that in Atlanta. I can remember going all sorts of different places, seeing what was going on, and then you get a call, and would you go to fence so and so, or would you go to fence so and so, or ground jury wants you to do this, and so on and so forth. So you have to be just available all the time. Communications were good. Nowadays, even then we had closed circuit television, but you didn't have it as extensively as you do nowadays. Now, there is a great temptation nowadays to just sit in the TV tent. And of course, you do see a lot more. But as a course designer and technical delegate, there is no substitute for being at a fence when a horse jumps it, to just see and feel. And I think partly because, although it's a long time ago, partly because I was an international rider myself, I still had a sort of feel for how the horses jump it and could almost sense myself sitting in that saddle. And that if you really want to know how the fences are jumping, how the course is riding, you've got to actually get out in real life.
Well, Hugh, thank you so much for your time this morning. We are going to hear lots more about how those fences rode from various competitors who were there at Atlanta. But in terms of setting the context and setting us up for what's going to be an exciting story, thank you again for taking the time. We really appreciate having you on.
Our next guest is the scientist Dr. David Marlin, of whom I'm sure many of our listeners will have heard and will have heard of his involvement with Atlanta. Welcome, David. It's very nice to have you here.
Hi, thank you very much. Funny talking about Atlanta. It seems a long time ago now.
It does, I agree. But I guess all Olympics probably have a very long-lasting effect in people's memories. But Atlanta, perhaps more than any other, changed a lot of things in terms of how we thought about what horses could do in competition in various extreme circumstances. Could you explain to us what your involvement with Atlanta was and how you became involved in the first place?
Yeah, sure. Well, it was actually, I almost hate to admit this, but it was by accident. I was working at the Animal Health Trust, and I was working mainly on respiratory and cardiovascular function in horses, and a bit on training. And we used to have weekly departmental meetings, and the last sort of thing in this particular day's meeting, I think it must have been late 1992, was a memo that was put on the table, said this is from the FBI, something to do with the Olympics, somebody needs to look into this. And it just sat on the table, and I was actually the most hungry, and I said, oh, I'll take it. And actually I didn't even look at it for about a week or two, and then when I did, I realized what an opportunity this was, and how important it was, especially with the problems that had just happened in Barcelona. So how I got involved was really just because I was hungry.
And what happened then?
Well, I had to come up to speed pretty quick. We didn't really know much about how horses coped with heat or heat and humidity at all back at that time. And so it was, a lot of phoning people in different parts of the world, talking to different people, looking at what the FBI was asking, trying to follow up on what had happened in Barcelona. And in Barcelona, it quickly became clear that the perceived wisdom was that if you were going to a hot country, you trained in the morning or in the evening and you avoided the heat. So the horses weren't being acclimatized. The second thing was that there was no aggressive cooling. So, and many horses at the end of the cross country in Barcelona got incredibly hot, and it was a really, I would say it was a narrow escape. And although some of the riders did say, after Barcelona that their horses weren't quite the same again. So, it was clear that Barcelona was a real near miss, that we were very lucky. And of course, Barcelona, hot and dry, that means horses, when they sweat, which is their primary means of keeping themselves cool, they were able to control their temperatures to some extent. But with Atlanta, with the combination of heat and humidity, which limits evaporation of sweat, then you're faced with a much more serious challenge from the climate.
And you essentially headed up what we've now called the Atlanta Project. What were the main findings of that?
Well, yeah, and that was a major sort of collaborative project with, and I always feel a little bit guilty that I get the credit, and everyone sort of remembers me, but there were a lot of different people involved. David Snow, Roger Harris, Paul Mills, and in the States we had Susie White at Georgia, Pat Maycooth in Georgia. There were lots of other people who, Pat Harris, there were so many people were involved in this because it was a major undertaking. And the first thing we had to do really was to understand what the demands were being placed on horses at 4-star level, because we really didn't have that information at all. So we ran some studies at real competitions at Burghley. In fact, we actually started off with a trial run at Blair Castle, and then we ran studies at Burghley in 1993 and 1994. And that was sort of doing things such as putting on heart rate monitors, looking at weight loss, because we don't, the climate is temperate at Burghley, definitely temperate at Blair Castle.
It's not known for its heat and humidity.
Yeah. No, although funnily enough, in '93 when we went there, we did have pretty good weather. But the organisers were incredibly supportive, and there's so many people we kind of have to say made a huge contribution to horse welfare, because it wasn't only it was the organisers, it was companies that loaned us equipment, and the riders themselves. We had sort of Mark Todd. We had Blyth Tait, we had a lot of the British riders, Matt Ryan, who was the world champion at the time, was the Olympic champion. And, they were, in a way, I'm still amazed that they would, take a chance and say, yeah, okay, we trust you. We'll let you put these things on our horses. We'll let you interfere with what is, for us, one of our biggest competitions in the calendar. And the important thing that I learned very early on is that you have to make sure what you collect is confidential and is treated confidentially, and also that you feed that back to the riders as well. So we were very lucky. We had lots of students. We had vet students. We had all sorts of different people helping out. Some people just making lunches. But it was, phenomenal, and that gave us a great start. And on the back of that, we then started running horses on the treadmill in controlled environmental conditions. We had to change our air conditioning system at Ballarton Lodge to be able to heat it up and make it hot and dry or hot and humid. That was no mean undertaking. And we started to try and understand how these different climates would affect unacclimatized horses. And then the next stage was to look at what would happen if you then trained those horses in those conditions. And finally, we ended up taking a group of European horses, Italian horses, German horses, British horses, and Belgian horses across to compete it was only a one-star event, but it was in Carolina in the summer, and we were able to sort of try out different modifications. We were able to look at the use of aggressive cooling, and of course at the time, as soon as we started putting ice water on horses, we had people screaming at us saying, you're going to cause that horse to tie up, you're going to cause that horse to have kidney failure. And of course none of that ever happened. You still hear those myths perpetuated. Surprisingly, are we 25 years on from 96?
Yeah.
2006. Wow, 25 years since Atlanta. We still hear those kind of cold water will cause horses to tie up. So it was, I packed a description of what was done into 2 minutes, but it was a huge volume of work. And generally everyone was pulling together. There was a little bit of competitiveness between some of the groups. We had the main funding from the FEI. They liked our proposal. So we were, the official, if you like, officially supported research group. But generally it was pretty much a good collaborative effort.
And so the information that you gathered and learnt from that, at what point was that sort of then disseminated to all the teams, and so they could prepare, in the right way?
Well, there was, I'm trying to think how that was managed. I was given a lot of seminars and talks. The interesting thing was whenever I did one of these, there was always someone from the Australian team in the front row. The Australians really did take a lot of notice and took very careful notes.
Well, it certainly worked out for them, yeah. Yeah, attention to detail.
The vet at the time was a guy called Dennis Goulding, who was, a smart guy, and who really was always asking me questions. And the FEI as well ran forums I spoke at one in Lausanne where all the federations were invited and were able to ask questions. And then, there were discussions in social sessions afterwards. Really, everyone should have had the information. We wrote articles, various sort of advice documents. So the FBI made a tremendous effort to get this information out to all of the teams. And there were even sort of, sessions at the test event and, at the games themselves. So they made a huge effort to try and make sure everyone was informed.
And what were you out there for the games?
I was out there for the test event in '95 and for the games themselves. In both cases, working for the FEI and the IOC. There were so many changes that happened as a result of all the research. Scheduling the competition to run as early as possible in the morning. Anyone in Atlanta or a hot sort of climate will tell you the best time is from first light till about sort of 10-11. It became clear that we couldn't run a normal long format in that climate. We had to give the horses an opportunity to be cooled down after the steeplechase because they wouldn't cool down themselves if they just went straight into the roads and tracks. So we had a cooling stop immediately after the roads and tracks, about sort of 2-3 minutes after they came off. 2-3 minutes after they came off of the steeplechase onto the first phase of roads and tracks. There was a cooling area where they had to be held and cooled and their temperatures taken before they were allowed to carry on. There was a reduction in overall effort because the cross country was built on a golf course, which was of course lovely footing, but it was in Atlanta. This golf course was really hilly, and we calculated that if they'd run a normal 4-star cross country, this would have been sort of getting on for almost twice as hard in that climate. Because of the hills and because of the heat and humidity, it would have been a ridiculously hard course. So the course was shortened significantly to take into account both the terrain and the heat and humidity. And as I say, generally there was pretty good acceptance from organisers, from course builders, from officials, and it ran pretty well. It did run pretty well. People often still say, well, it wasn't that hot, but it was the hottest Olympics we'd ever had. And it's still up there as one of the, if we combine the temperature and humidity and the lack of wind and the strong sun into what we call the WBGT index, that was actually one of the other real sort of things that made it much easier to manage, was having a better assessment of the conditions rather than just looking at heat, temperature and humidity. We applied this index called the WBGT index, and that's what's been used by the FEI to manage equestrian competitions ever since Atlanta. And in fact, we've also helped polo to introduce it. We've also.
And what is that index?
Well, it's called the Wet Bulb Globe Temperature Index. And what it does is you have a sensor inside a black globe. It's a copper globe, a bit like an old ballcock. And that is sat about 1.5 meters off the ground. So it's measuring the conditions at the sort of level of the horse's body. And then we also have a probe that sits inside one of these white screens, Stevenson screen, which measures the temperature and humidity. So the black globe is the globe temperature, and that globe gets heated up by the sun, whether it's directly onto the globe or reflected off the ground. and it gets cooled down by any breeze. And then the wet bulb is a combination of both air temperature and air humidity. And as I say, there's a formula that we use to calculate this WBGT. So I can tell you that in our summers, when we're feeling really hot, the thermal load measured by WBGT would be around somewhere like 24, 25 maximum. And most of the time in this country, it's 20, 21, even on a nice summer day. In Atlanta, we had sort of up around, 29, 30. In the Young Riders Championships in Chicago in 95, where we actually went and monitored the competition, we recorded WBGT values of 35. Now, the horses were okay, but we had about 4 or 5 riders taken to hospital with heat stroke.
Really?
So,
yeah.
And, Barcelona would have been 30. Atlanta could have been 33. What we've learned is that 28 is pretty much the threshold we have to make changes to competitions at. 33 is not really compatible with safe competition. And that is what the FEI has as their guidelines. In fact, if you look at what Tokyo is proposing for it's funny, the IOC has been quite slow to apply WBGT into other disciplines, but now it's pretty much used to run the games. So TOCOG will be saying, or have said, 33 is the point at which you stop competition. It's too much.
And what do they anticipate it will be in Tokyo?
Well, it could be... Tokyo, being by the sea, has a bit like us, can have quite a variable climate. One day it can be sort of 26, the next day it can be up at 32. And we are in that range pretty much most of the time where the competition needs to be modified. The FBI has had now a lot of experience of doing this with obviously Beijing in Hong Kong, Beijing Olympics in Hong Kong, Athens, Rio was sort of borderline, Tryon, World Equestrian Games. So there's been a lot of experience in how to apply the guidelines. And Tim Hadaway, who is of course now within the FEI and is effectively running the equestrian liaison with the local organising committee. Tim is extremely familiar with WBGT and how it can be used. And so my role, I was there obviously at the test event and working for the FEI in terms of monitoring the conditions, but also looking at how the horses were coping and talking to a lot of the officials who will be working there. And I will be there at the games this summer in a support capacity for the FEI in terms of being able to help discuss what the expected weather conditions are and discussing the appropriate modifications. These are all written down on these are now all documented, what will happen in what discipline, what the contingencies are. There's an incredibly high level of planning that's gone on. But I'm there as just to give that final yes. I agree. Yeah. You've got it right. One of the other really interesting innovations that the FEI is introducing for Tokyo is the non-invasive monitoring of horses in training, warm-up and competition using thermal imaging, which was something that a UK-based thermographer called Helen Reynolds and myself, we trialled it at the test event, and it worked much, much better than we expected it to. It was really a long shot, because anyone who knows about thermal imaging would say the first thing is you can't use it outside on moving horses in full sunlight. And in theory, you shouldn't be able to. In practice, you can. And we were able to relate the horses' body temperatures to their skin temperatures. from sort of 10 metres away without having to interfere with the riders at all. And so that will be used. It's incredibly exciting because it gives the opportunity for stewards and the veterinary commission to be able to keep an eye on horses, and if they do have a concern, talk to the chef de keep or the coach or the team vet and allow them to make an intervention without having to interfere with riders, because the whole ethos that the FEI bases running these competitions on is that it should be a fair competition with as little interference with the athletes and teams as possible.
It must have been incredibly satisfying to get to the end of Atlanta with what I, from my knowledge, was a lot of, healthy, safe horses returned at the end of the day. That must have been the sort of, the point of it all, really, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to say, I probably, I don't have much hair now, and I probably lost most of it in the lead into Atlanta. it was, as you say, or as I think you're alluding to, it's a massive responsibility to have advised, what is possible, how things should happen, and to, it was an incredible relief when it all went so well. But, the danger we have now, which we saw in Tryon at the World Equestrian Games, unfortunately there were so many problems in Tryon, as we know, but there was a little bit of complacency. What we learned is that most teams didn't acclimatise, because although the FEI had moved the competition from August to September based on the analysis that I provided them with, they made the decision, and absolutely the right decision, to move the games back a month. The problem was that many teams thought that meant it was okay in September. And although we tried to get the message across that it was still going to be, very challenging, it does appear that most teams didn't take steps to acclimatise their horses. And, I think we had a little bit of a near miss in Tryon.
Okay.
So hopefully Tryon was a little bit of a wake-up call to remind people, that it's not just the FEI's responsibility. The FEI can put in place, all the best possible facilities and protocols and adjust the competitions. The FEI can do as much as it can, but there still needs to be that responsibility on the part of the teams to prepare their horses and to come prepared for the climate, to understand what the implications are of competing in such a climate.
Yes, and as a result of your and other people's research, there's no excuse for not doing that. David, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Our next guest is journalist Tait Green. She is currently the deputy editor of Country Life magazine, but in the Atlanta days, she was editor of the much missed Eventing magazine, and she reported the eventing competition at Atlanta for Eventing. Hi, Tait.
Hello, Catherine. Morning. It's so nice to hear you.
Tell us about Atlanta. You were there reporting. What were the working conditions like for you?
Well, this was the first of 4 Olympics that I was lucky enough to go to, and I was incredibly excited. It was also my first. I think it was my first trip out of Europe. I don't think I'd ever been to America before, and I was completely unprepared for the sort of, it was like being met by a wet hairdryer at the airport. You stepped out of blasting, freezing airport and absolutely out into this extraordinarily wet heat. And that took some getting used to. Our working conditions were, I mean, they were fantastic. I mean, we had a lovely freezing cold media tent, but we did all get coughs and colds because you were going, you'd been outside in your damp clothes, and then you'd go into this sort of Arctic atmosphere. So an awful lot of people, I mean, riders as well, I think, were sort of coughing and spluttering. But it was great. There was no grub.
Always a disadvantage.
Journalists always like their grub, and there was one coffee stand which served the entire population. So that served the spectators as well as us and as well as officials. And we sneaked into Rosemary Barlow in those days. She had her wonderful tent that spectators paid to go into, and she was very kind to us journalists and would let us in. And we used to do, it was terribly expensive, so we used to send one person backwards and forwards to the buffet tent. And I still have a photograph of Sue Benson throwing grapes into Alan Smith's mouth. He was the very distinguished Daily Telegraph correspondent at the time. But as far as working was fine. Conditions, it was absolutely fine. The transport was a complete disaster, so that was quite stressful, because Atlanta, instead of using local volunteers, which anyone with any sense would have done, they used people from all over the states, and so buses were continually getting lost. And there's an apocryphal story of one poor, I think he might have been a judo athlete, and he actually missed his heat. So there were all kinds of dramas like that, and they were pretty aggressive as well. They didn't mind sort of waving guns at you. So that side of it had its excitements.
And what those days, there was a much wider range of media attending major championships, weren't there? I mean, all the papers sent journalists, which sadly doesn't happen anymore.
Yes, they did. The cross-country day always, proper sports editors used to descend from the newspapers, and the photographers. There were real sports photographers there with their enormous cameras, and so everybody. It was great, actually, because it really sort of made you raise your game. And I know that Trevor Meeks, who was the horse and hound photographer then, he always used to say that an Olympics really made him raise his game, because you were surrounded by mainstream journalists, and that was what was so exciting about it in many ways. It also meant that sport was under much more scrutiny, and the press conferences could be lively, and yes, it was exciting. It did make it more exciting, and it did make it inspiring. And there was a lot of worry before Atlanta, because there's quite a lot of disapproval about it as a venue for equestrian events. And I think that sort of people forget that in those days in America, there was an organisation called the Humane Society, and they were like sort of animal rights, and they were pretty annoyed about Atlanta, because they were worried about what was going to happen to the horses. And a lot of people were quite scarred, not only by the 1978 World Championships, when a lot of horses were not seen again afterwards, or certainly never came back to form afterwards. I mean, even the winner, Mike Tango, didn't really do much after that. And people were also scarred by an incident in Barcelona, where an exhausted Russian horse was just winched by a crane onto the back of a truck. And that appalling image of this unconscious horse being winched onto a truck was beamed all around the world. It was taken by an agency photographer, and it ended up in the Times. And so, there was scrutiny, and there was interest, and quite a lot of people wrote. I remember running all sorts of comment pieces in Eventing magazine from people like Mary Gordon Watson saying, this is a terrible idea, because they really sort of feared a repeat of Kentucky in Atlanta. And it was an absolute triumph, and a triumph of organisation, and a triumph of scientific effort and veterinary effort, and also the work of Hugh Thomas as TD to make sure that the Atlanta was a success. And horses came back from Atlanta really well.
And who were the sort of pre-event favourites?
Britain. The previous year was it had been an Open European Championships at Bretoni del Vivaro, and Britain won team gold. Mary King, I think she won the individual bronze medal on King William when she was pregnant. And yes, no, Britain was definitely favourite, and William Fox Pitt was on a good horse called Cosmopolitan. And the New Zealanders had finished second in Bretoni, despite not being Europeans, because it was an Open European Championship. And they had finished second despite being mounted on their second strings and young horses. So those two teams, I would have said, were definitely the favourites. And there was enormous disappointment and disbelief that the British effort ended so dismally. Not particularly since we'd also had the disaster in Barcelona, which people aren't really used to British teams. In those days they weren't used to British teams coming adrift, and so there was massive criticism afterwards.
And what happened? Remind me. I mean, did they do reasonably well in the dressage, the Brits? I think
yes,
they did.
They did. Ian Stark did a really lovely test on Stanek. He was the pathfinder, and he did a beautiful test on Stanek Ghost. And I can't remember whether we were in the lead or not, but we would have been high up. I mean, the Australians were only sixth after dressage. So that just shows how they managed to turn the competition around with their fantastic cross-country rounds. And
what was the cross-country course like?
I can't really remember it, but it wasn't a walk in the park. It was very green and very lush because it was so wet and so humid, and it was a bit slippy. And the image that does stick in my mind is of Blyth Tait. He was the very first person to go across country, and he set out at about 7:00 in the morning. And it was virtually dark, and it was dewy, and it wasn't particularly cool even then, but it was cool enough. And yes, it was. I really remember the kind of damp feeling in the air. It was big. The water, I seem to remember, caused quite a bit of difficulty. There was also a water complex with a kind of Normandy bank, I think, into it. And various people came unstuck there. Andrew Nicholson came unstuck with Jägermeister, who was pulling hard. Ian fell coming out of a water complex, and that really set the seal on the British team's day. William's horse Cosmopolitan slipped, and I can't remember if William was unseated or not, but certainly they slipped and they stopped. And then Gary Parsonage went out. He had a fantastic round. His was the best cross-country score of the lot. But because there was a tremendous sort of psychological impact on cross-country day for the teams, because none of them were going to get an individual medal because there were two competitions. So the individual competition was coming separately with separate horses, separate everything. And so if you were forced to go for your team and you knew you'd got to go out and you'd got to try and get a team completion, and that anything could happen on the last day, and of course you've got to keep going, but incredibly demotivating when you knew that really you'd fallen out of the medals. And that was the situation for Karen Dixon when she went out forced to go. And I think probably it was a dreadful experience that I think probably stayed with her for quite a long time afterwards, and she went clear. But I think trying to motivate herself in the hottest part of the day was must have been very hard going.
And the mood in Team GBR camp must have been pretty dismal that night.
It was pretty dismal. And the next day, poor Ian Stark had a terrible show jumping round on Stanek Ghost. And that really sort of set the seal on it. It was sort of echoes of Andrew Nicholson's round in Barcelona on Spinning Rhombus. It was just a horse that didn't want to pick up its feet on the last day. And so that was deeply, deeply depressing. And there was an awful lot of criticism of the British team afterwards, because King William then went and did exactly the same thing in the individual competition, and there was much criticism of the selectors and of the riders themselves. And why on earth have we sent these horses that can't show jump? And there was a lot of introspection and afterwards, and much criticism actually.
And the Aussies won team gold.
Yes, they were spectacular across country. And after Barcelona, there was a lot of sort of commentary about how Britain had been thought itself, British teams were too clever after the dressage, and then hadn't sort of really gone for it across country. And whereas the Australians and New Zealanders had just sort of bombed round. And so there was much unfair criticism of British team tactics as well. And the Australians, they were just going to do it. They were just out for it. I think that I remember Wendy Schaeffer, and she had a little bay Australian thoroughbred. I think he was an ex-racehorse. I think he'd come off the racehorse track. And she just flew around and was massively confident, massively positive. And, said afterwards in the press conference, we were just on it. We went for it. We knew we could catch up. And Andrew Hoy, it was his second Olympic gold medal, and he was riding Darien Powers, a horse that, that's an example of a horse coming out of the competition really well, because he then rode that horse in Sydney. And did many more 4 stars on that horse. And they were just incredibly positive and brave. And of course, there was much attention surrounding the late and much lamented Jill Rolton, who was riding a grey horse called Peppermint Grove. And Peppermint Grove had been her Barcelona horse. And she slipped on the flat and broke her collarbone. And so ended up getting her medal on the last day with her arm in a sling. And so, the whole image was of a really feisty, brave team that didn't sort of hang about moaning because they were 6th after dressage, but had just really gone for it.
And I get a home Olympics is always a really big deal. What the Americans, that Kerry Milliken won a medal. What was the sort of feeling about, the American team?
The American team won silver. And David and Karen O'Connor were on the team together with Bruce Davidson, and the 4th rider was called a Jill somebody or other, and she did have a stop, but the other 3 went clear. And so for Bruce, it was a huge thing for him to win an Olympic medal on home ground, and he was a brilliant team member. And the O'Connors, it was wonderful for them because it's so often a married couple, they don't both do well. And so it was very special for the pair of them to be on a team, and for both of them to have done well, and both of them to have got their medal together. And I remember Karen saying in the press conference, this is a very special thing that we are going to take back into our lives, this silver medal. So there was much jubilation, and it was actually very fascinating because, of course, we watched television, we watched all the sports on telly, and unlike many other countries' coverage, it was all about the Americans. And so even if an American finished 8th in a heat, the cameras would focus on the American, and quite often we had absolutely no idea who'd won the medals. It literally was all about the American performance. So for the eventers, it was a really, really big thing.
And I always think the fascinating thing about going to a championship is that you see brilliant performances from people you've barely heard of. That people rise to the occasion on this one special day on a horse. And do you remember any of those? Do you remember anyone catching your eye from, a less
successful eventing nation?
I remember, well, it's hard to believe, but of course at the time, the Germans were not a successful eventing nation. And I believe that, I seem to remember that both Bettina Hoy, she was Bettina Overesch then, I seem to remember that she was a team member, I think, and I seem to remember that she went very well. I mean, we didn't know much about Wendy Schaeffer, because she hadn't really been over to Europe very much. The Australians were very big on trying to use, they always have been, but they were very big then on using homegrown riders and not necessarily ones that had travelled. And poor Matt Ryan, who was the reigning champion, his horse was lame on arrival in Atlanta, so he didn't run. So I think she was quite a revelation, really, Wendy Schaeffer. I don't think anybody particularly unexpected did do anything startling, in all truth. I think it was, because the Kiwis won the bronze medal, and they possibly were expected to have won the gold as well. They were very strongly tipped. So I don't really recall anybody from the team competition doing sort of particularly unexpectedly well. But of course, Sally Clark, who won the silver medal in the individual competition behind Blyth and ahead of Kerry Milliken, she, I suppose, was quite unexpected. I think she was a PE teacher, and she had the one good horse, Squirrel Hill. And so, it was a fairy tale result for her, and that was a good story at the time. That was somebody different.
America, often Olympics are in countries that don't have a big equestrian following, but America obviously does. Were there loads of spectators? Were the stadiums really full?
Yes, there were plenty of spectators. They suffered quite a bit because, there was no shade around the arena. And what I do remember is these poor people sort of crouching underneath the stands in the intervals. They just, I can remember now to this day, a mother with her small child crawling in underneath the stands in order to get some shade. It was absolutely relentless. And of course, it was pretty relentless on cross country day. I mean, there were lots and lots of trucks with these energy drinks. They were all the most revolting colour, and you slugged those down, and so there was plenty of that around. But I mean, there were quite a lot of people, I think, who were treated for sort of sunstroke and just general overheating. We walked the day we walked the cross country course, the day the press were allowed to walk the cross country course, and I'm sure there was a bit of an irony here, but we were sent out in the hottest part of the day. It was on Trot Up Day. And it was a course walk with the course designer, Roger Haller. And we weren't supposed to stray and walk the course on our own. We had to stick with him in this group. And of course, British journalists weren't really sort of used to these kind of strictures. Anyway, we got to about fence 2, and we'd been standing around in this baking heat while the sort of American journalists were asking questions about literally the first fence. And it was just unbearable. And so myself and Jenny MacArthur, who's the Times reporter, and Gillian Newsom, who wrote for The Guardian and actually for Country Life in those days, and she and I, the three of us, we set off. And they weren't terribly pleased with us, but we did make it to the end of the course. Felt very, very feeble at the end of the course. We were taken back to the press tent in a kind of golf cart. And meanwhile, everybody else by fence 6 had literally fallen apart. My boss, Michael Clayton, had to be taken off in a golf cart, much too hot by fence 6. So we did feel sort of slightly smug. But I have to say that I felt incredibly faint during the trot up. And had to go and sort of sit under a tree somewhere, feeling really very sort of sick and faint and dehydrated. and it really taught me a lesson about how you had to keep rehydrating the entire time.
So the horses came out a bit better than the journalists, really.
The horses came out of it way better than the journalists. Some journalists also managed to walk through some long grass when they were walking the course, and they got bitten by insects. So there was quite a bit of that going on as well. There were a few hazards.
And there were bombings in Atlanta, weren't there? How did that impact on any of the equestrian events, or
it really made you feel a bit uneasy? We all went into. I mean, the sort of sad thing about Atlanta, aside from the fact that it was a very successful competition, the sad thing was that we did feel quite divorced from the games. It was way out, but we all went in by train because the big thing in those days was to get your media pack, which was full of kind of loads of freebies and souvenirs. And
I never got mine in London. I'm still upset about it. Yeah.
Well, I feel for you, because that was the absolute big thing. And, I've still got my fake discus from Athens. And I can't remember what we got in Atlanta, but anyway, it was a big deal. And we all piled in and went in. And yes, it did make sort of people feel a bit uneasy. And Michael Clayton, he used to be a war correspondent, and he'd been through Vietnam and Northern Ireland and all that sort of thing. So he was sort of rather overexcited by the idea of this big news story, and said, right, I think I'd better go in. I think I'll go. You all stay here. You stay here. I'll go in and see. So off he went. So the story went away, but yes, certainly, it was. I do remember it as being a very sort of high security Olympics, and there was, unlike sort of others, which really have been an awful lot more sort of friendly, and people have sort of got used to seeing you coming in every day. There were sort of far more strictures, and there was quite a bit of sort of falling out between sort of testy photographers and car parking attendants. And there was a memorable morning. It was a cross country morning, and we were up in the dark catching a bus, and there were only sort of X number of seats left on this bus. So some photographers who are well known to all of us barged past Grania Willis and I to get on the bus and said, we're photographers, we're way more important, you can just catch up, but we've got to get there and take the photographs. And so they got on the bus. Grania and I got another bus, and we got to the press office, and then there was this frantic call from out on the cross country course, please bring boiled eggs. Because we used to boil up eggs every morning and take those in because there was no food on the place. And so did we go out on the cross-country course with the eggs? No, we didn't. They had to whistle for them. But there was a lot of certainly getting in and out was, was an adventure every time. Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at the team results, and actually Japan finished 6th, just behind Britain. And it's interesting just because we make such a fuss about how brilliantly the Japanese have done in the past few years in the build-up to, the Tokyo Games, but actually their history in eventing is longer than we sometimes remember it is.
Yes, well, that is a very good reminder. When you asked me if there was anyone who caught the eye, yes, the Japanese riders, they did go very well indeed, and we do forget that they have a longer history in the sport than we remember. And of course, a lot of they and the Koreans all prepared for the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, because there was a Korean team there. There used to be Korean riders who were competent as well, and I think it was a sort of residue of that. And now that they have Tokyo in their sights, they are sort of massively motivated to go again, and I would think they have to be they would have to have a chance of a medal in Tokyo.
They actually finished 2 places above the Germans in Atlanta. 3 places above the Germans. The Germans were 9th.
The Germans
and the poor old Irish were 11th. They didn't have a good
the
Atlanta.
Germans and the Irish were both in the doldrums around about that time. And of course the Irish they'd had the year before Atlanta, they'd had an individual gold medalist in the form of Lucy Thompson, which was a tremendous fillip, and she had good horses, but yes, the overall effort did not come off at all in Atlanta, which was very sad.
Well, Kate, but thank you so much for talking to us. That was fascinating.
Now, our next guest on this Atlanta special is a lady who was part of the gold medal winning Australian team. Welcome to the show, Wendy Schaeffer Macdonald.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks for having me.
We're looking forward to hearing your memories on Atlanta. So I thought I would start by sort of taking it back to the build-up. Tell us about your build-up, because I think I'm right in saying you didn't actually have the easiest one personally in the weeks before the games.
Look, it was a very interesting build-up from that point of view. 9 weeks before the Olympics, I broke both bones in my lower leg. So the tibia is the main weight-bearing bone, and that was a big issue, and also the fibula, the ones that on the outside of the ankle there. So, look, I was very, very lucky to ride at Atlanta at all, and I look back and go, gosh, how did that sort of happen or work at all? But I was, fortunate to be back in Australia and had a fall at a horse trials, just kind of trying to keep myself fit, I suppose, between having completed badminton back in May and then coming back to Atlanta, preparing from England for Atlanta while my horse was spelling after badminton. I fractured my leg there and had that pinned and plated in Adelaide at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, and was very lucky to have great treatment and support there, and had braces and other bits, I suppose, to make it happen, including, I think it was an electromagnetic coil that was sort of on my leg 24/7. It was an interesting time, and I was very, very fortunate that my horse Sunburst was back in England, and my sort of trainer there, Maggie Dole, and her staff, and so we were able to keep him fit while I was rehabilitating, and I think I got back on him in about 4 weeks post-op after having the surgery on my leg, and Atlanta was exactly 9 weeks post-op, 9 weeks from the time it was broken, so it's sort of 8.5 weeks, I suppose, after the surgery and the implantation of the medal and so forth. So an interesting time, but I suppose prior to that we'd had the badminton run and had a really super run there. So as far as preparation, as a combination for what was a very difficult cross-country course at Atlanta, we were well prepared on that front, and a really good team. Sunburst and I, we'd grown up together. I was 12 years old. I was 11 and he was 6, I think, when we first got together. So literally 10 years later in Atlanta, we knew each other pretty well.
That's amazing. So you're only 21 going to your first Olympics?
Yes, unfortunately, it's been the only, but yes, 21 going to Atlanta. So I, had that magical sort of partnership very early on in my career. We'd been into the World Games 2 years prior to that, and had a pretty good result. I'd had a bit of a technical glitch, shall we say, at the water jump, and landed sort of up his neck. Unfortunately, he did sort of peter to a stop in a big stone wall in the middle of the water jump. But I, was able to swing back on, get going, and still finished inside the time. I think one of 3 horses to do that at the World Games. So look, he was awesome little horse, and we were very experienced together by the time we got to Atlanta.
And what was the feeling like in sort of the Team Australia camp, because obviously going in as defending champions?
Yeah, I mean, obviously pretty serious about it. We went and stayed in a place called Conyers for, I think, almost about 2 weeks prior to Atlanta. So that was the acclimatization sort of period. We didn't want to go straight into the heat and humidity, but give the horses a bit of chance to prepare. And look, I suppose you're in a training camp with people, obviously, that are competing for positions on the team with. So that's relatively intense. The Australian horse that have flown across there also. I believe there was perhaps 3 horses across from Australia, and the bulk of the horses came out of England, for those particular Olympics. But it was a great time, but also fairly intense, and obviously some were going to get in and some weren't. So always makes for interesting sort of dynamics, I suppose.
Where was that training camp again? Sorry.
Conyers, I think it's Conyers.
Whereabouts is that?
Now I need to Google it. So it would have been not as far south, I believe, as Atlanta was.
Okay, but over in the US, because that leads me on to my that leads me on to my next question, because obviously one of the things that we're talking about on this show and was a real concern going into the games was the acclimatization to the heat and humidity. I guess coming from Australia, to a degree, you were used to dealing with that to an extent. What was the feeling around sort of preparation and making sure that horses were fit and ready? Did you do anything particularly differently?
Probably not a whole lot differently. I mean, my horse has been been based in England since, basically came back from the World Championships, so Den Haag. The interesting thing was, and it's interesting looking back, but it was probably hotter and more difficult conditions in Den Haag and eventually than it was in Atlanta, even though we'd prepared more for Atlanta, I suppose. But fortunately for the 2 cross-country days in Atlanta, it wasn't that hot and humid, and the horses almost got a bit cold with all the misting fans and so forth in between them, which sounds ridiculous now, but that's sort of just how it was with those days for the cross-country. But yeah, we'd prepared, I suppose, by having the acclimatization in America, but not as hot and humid as Atlanta, and I suppose doing our gallops in England when it was the hotter part of the day.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about, obviously, it was a team competition and an individual competition for the first time in Olympic history. What was the feeling around that? Was it a popular choice?
Look, as far as I was concerned, when I was obviously very new to it all and so forth, was that was just how it was, and we'd been told well in advance. So sort of people were like, oh my gosh, you finished top of the table, and that would have been, individual medal and so. But we knew that was never going to be the case. And, I was very grateful, I suppose, looking back that, all of our three of our horses finished, because there potentially could have been, 2 horses be, first and second in the world as they were. We think individually our horses finished first, second and fourth in Atlanta in the table, shall we say, not in the team competition. And so potential for one of those horses not to have trotted up, for instance, and the team to have not finished and no one got anything, even though they did really well. So that certainly negated any shall we say, any problem we felt with not getting the individual medals, if I'm making sense with that.
Yeah, no, that does. What about your own Olympics experience? So you're 21, you're on the horse that you've produced yourself all the way up through the levels. Talk us through your sort of Atlanta competition and how it unfolded for you.
Look, I think you look back and just go, it was amazing, A, that I was there at all, but B, that it came off like it did, and that was hardly training to any real level. Certainly if you look 6 weeks before the games, but then even really sort of 2 to 3 weeks before the games wasn't on peak form. I hadn't even jumped in before, or personally jumped myself until I actually got to America. I remember just heading out for a little kind of hack in the forest, and maybe I'll just have a little pop over that little, kind of 50 or whatever it was, I don't know, 80 centimeter log or something. Oh, good, if it was all right, okay. So, it was very, you look back and just go, how did that work? So relatively underprepared, but very much had a fantastic relationship with the horse. And at Atlanta, it just went my way, went our team's way, certainly. I don't think a team's ever won by so much before. I think it won by 57 points or something ridiculous. But yeah, for me, it just went the best it possibly could. So I think I was probably lucky to get on the team, or certainly wasn't chosen to get on the team, shall we say, by the other riders necessarily. But that's, I suppose, the selectors felt that's the combinations they had, and different sort of, I suppose, pluses and minuses for all of us. So it did. But yeah, I mean, the competition itself, we did probably a PB dressage score. It wasn't an amazing test looking back on it, but I was pretty happy with the time. He spooked a little bit at some of the TV cameras down the bottom, but basically did a really solid test. He was a real trier. And then cross country, we again had a really good run. It was a little bit slippery, actually. I think the course was fairly new grass, and obviously later in the day, I think Gillian Walton was our third team member, I think. So she had the sort of misfortune to sort of really struggle with that slippery grass and turn up, and the horse fell over on his side and so forth. So yeah, that was interesting, but it was a pretty tough course. The water jump was very similar to badminton's, so that rode pretty big. I think that in general the course was bigger than they thought it was going to be, or the riders perhaps thought it was going to be, but that really sort of suited us. I suppose our strength had been our cross country, and I suppose that the 11.6 time pulse doesn't sound fast, but I think it was fourth fastest. So basically pretty happy. I was, wouldn't probably have changed too much on the cross country ride itself.
Did you feel going into the show jumping any additional pressure? The Australian team were reasonably comfortable at this point. Did you feel the pressure? I think you jumped a clear round on the final day as well.
Yeah, he's a great little jumper. And so I think the biggest pressure was not to screw it up. Obviously, you've just got to finish. So it's not, you've got to not only have one rail down, it's just, but you need to jump all 12 fences and go through the start and finish legs. Yes. Aside from that, I mean, look, obviously you put pressure on yourself to perform well. You want to do justice to your horse, etc. And we'd done a lot of show jumping. He's a very accomplished show jumper. Sort of jumped up to about 1.40 m back in Australia before he went to England even. So yeah, I mean, it was obviously that's what we sort of thought we were there to do. And so yeah, probably not extra pressure. And obviously you're in Olympic Games, and it was fantastic just to kind of be there and enjoy that moment. And I think, to be fair too, when you're younger, you don't perhaps quite have or put the same pressure on yourself. I was just really enjoying the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a serious moment to come away from your first Olympics with a team gold. Do you think, looking back, obviously so much more experience now, did Atlanta change the sport in any way?
I mean, I suppose it was a period of change as such. So obviously it changed again for Sydney. I mean, I think it's really interesting to look back at it. You think they're just splitting the competition, so surely just meant it cost more money. So I'm not sure if it particularly helped the sport sort of stay in the Olympics, and now we're getting less and less people sort of to the Olympics too. So it's hard to know really. But I suppose it was still in that experimental stage really in Atlanta, because it changed for Sydney, it changed again for Athens, and then I think we probably changed again for Beijing and so forth. So but it was probably one of the last really serious cross country tests, I think, is probably fair to say.
Thank you, Wendy.
You are welcome. Enjoy the rest of the process then.
Now, the next person we are going to hear from on this Atlanta special is the man who took home the individual gold medal. Friend of the show, the absolute legend that is Blyth Tait. Blyth, thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. What a build-up.
No pressure. We're obviously going to talk a lot about sort of the effects of Atlanta and your journey when you were there as well, and because it was a very, very successful Olympic Games for you. But just tell us about the build-up, because it was an Olympics in Atlanta. Were you based in New Zealand, the UK, as part of your build-up? Give us sort of set the scene for us.
Okay, well, it was a long time ago, so I may be a bit foggy in my memory, but I was definitely based in the UK. And was it the first time that the competition split into an individual competition and a team competition?
Yeah.
It was. And I think that was a little bit significant as well, because initially I wasn't selected on Ready Teddy. He was a reserve horse. And I was selected on Chesterfield, who was my leading horse at the time, and I was selected for the team because, really, for selection point of view, the team took priority. So I was selected as individual reserve with Ready Teddy, and he travelled across. And I remember at the time thinking that I didn't mind that, because he was only 8 years old. He was only a young horse. And if he didn't get to compete as travelling reserve, he would have come home to the UK and then been turned away until the following season. But as good luck would have it on my behalf and bad luck for poor old Mark, KM pulled a muscle when we were out in Atlanta, and so Ready Teddy got the call up. So I was a last minute entry into the individual with him.
Okay, so it was Mark Todd that was going to be in that individual slot, but actually you ended up with two horses, one in the team, one in the individual. As part of if we stay with the build-up for a second, as part of that, we've talked a bit about the conditions and Hugh Thomas and the preparation that went in from an organisational point of view and making sure that, it was as safe as possible. Was there anything that you guys in the New Zealand team camp did differently to make sure that the horses were going to be acclimatized?
Again, I can't really recall. I do know that there was great concern about the humidity and the heat that was potentially going to occur, and so there was an incredible amount of research and preparation went into it from the organisers' point of view, and Hugh's probably told you all about that. And, I would have to say, looking back, they were incredibly thorough and they were really ahead of the game. So in other words, there was no surprises to be had. They'd looked at all the scenarios, they had all the data, and they'd taken it very carefully. I do remember that it was long format in those days, and I do remember that on the roads and tracks we had compulsory 10-minute halts and a cooling station where they were able to monitor the horses' temperatures, bring their temperatures down if required, and I guess, prevent the horses from going on if necessary. Having said that, I was drawn number one to go in the team competition on Chesterfield, and the competition started really early. I think I set off on phase A at 6 a.m, still dark, and I do recall when I got to the first calling station, there was, all of the world's best veterinarians and all the high-powered people waiting to say, how is it, Blyth? What is there anything you need? And I said, yes, I need a jacket. I'm freezing cold. But they prevented any major issues, and they were incredibly successful from a horse welfare point of view. And the Olympics are something that the whole world gets involved in, whether they have a equestrian background or not. So it's very important that, we present really good pictures, and I think that they were very successful in doing that, there's no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you headed out to Atlanta. You've got two horses. How far out from the competition did Mark's horse pull his muscle? When did Ready Teddy get the call up? We were based at a place called Fox Hall, away from the Olympic, the Olympic site for at least a week, if not a little bit longer. I do recall we seemed to be out there for quite some time, and it was a great experience because all the teams were based out there, and we sort of got together for sports afternoons and various evening parties and things like that. So it was the whole build up was it was fun and it was enjoyable. So we must have been there for a wee while, and I know that unfortunately KM went out while we were at Fox Hill, not once we'd moved into the Olympic environment. So it must have been, fairly early into the settling in period over there. My memory's a bit shaky now. It's a while ago. That's all right. That's okay. Okay, so you are representing New Zealand at an Olympics, and you've got two horses. By this point in your career as well, we should say that you have already been to the championships by this point, because you'd already won the World Championships in Stockholm and Barcelona. So it was your second Olympic Games.
Barcelona Olympics, yes. Yeah,
absolutely. But it was Ready Teddy's championship debut, as you say. Chesterfield was your team horse. Yeah. What was it like lining up on two horses in Olympic Games? Because actually it's the dream to go to an Olympics, and actually you're there with not one bite at the cherry, but two.
Yeah. I remember the team competition definitely went first. And as I said, I was first to go. So, there was an immediate sort of, not pressure, but, we sort of dived straight into it. And I don't recall the individual as being an afterthought. I think it was still just as important to me as a rider, and I think to everyone else as well that was there. But it definitely followed on from the team competition. It must have just about been back to back. I don't even recall us having a day off in between. But so that was, quite unique in that we had a week long of competition. But, I mean, I was used to riding two horses at a competition by that stage. I, quite often had two horses at Badminton or two horses at Burley. So I guess you just learn to spread your focus across both horses. And I think that's what happened there. I don't think many people competed in both competitions. I know that Andrew Nicholson and I both did for New Zealand, so we were together in that respect, and maybe one or two others did. I think Ian Stark might have for
David
Britain.
O'Connor did, I think.
But most people, I think, were in one competition or the other. When I started on Chesterfield in the team competition, it was so early in the morning that there was still an awful lot of dew on the grass, and it was incredibly slippery. We had studs in, but I remember that it was like being on a skating rink, and I was really disappointed in myself when I came through the finish race because I had to button off a little bit to stay on my feet, basically. And I had, a number of times, it's not a huge number. I ended up, I think, having the third fastest time of the day or something like that. But I was disappointed thinking that, I could have gone better. But it turned out that it was slick for most of the competitors, and the time sort of came a bit slower. And then at the end of the competition, I remember that he would have finished third as an individual in the team competition. I was thinking, oh, God, what a shame. I missed out on the opportunity of getting an individual medal. So, I guess for the poor people that were only riding for the team, there would have always been that in the back of their mind that, it was the team effort that they were after. And I'm sure that a good performance rewarded with a team medal. But, to have the opportunity to go again in the individual, I think was something quite special. And so I guess maybe that elevated me, and with the, the motivation from the team competition, maybe that helped a bit.
So you did the team competition, and that ran the dressage, the cross country, and the show jumping, the medal ceremony, and then the individual competition started.
As far as I can remember, yes.
Okay.
And maybe the trot up was on the same day as the show jumping or something. I don't recall, but it seemed to go back to back in my memory. Yeah.
Okay, so you went straight in. So you took
They
team.
definitely weren't interlinked. They were definitely run separately. Yeah.
Separately. Okay, so you took the team bronze from a New Zealand perspective. Took the team bronze. We actually we will speak to Wendy Schaeffer, who was part of that Australian team who won a team gold on this show. But then going into the individual competition, did you have any expectation? Because obviously Ready Teddy, only an 8-year-old, his first Olympics. You've obviously already competed. You sort of found your way around the course. Yes, it was different, but you'd got a feel for the footing and that it was perhaps going to be a bit slippy and a tough track. What were your thoughts with him at the start of that competition? Did you have an expectation?
No, I didn't have expectations of winning. That would be too extreme. I did have an incredible opinion of the horse. I mean, he certainly was an exciting prospect for the future, of whether he was going to be really right then. He was always a little bit volatile in an atmosphere. So, I knew that he probably wasn't going to be leading the dressage, but he was a phenomenal jumper, and he was also very careful, along with being pretty brave. So I had the utmost confidence in him, and, I just, when I walked the course, etc., I didn't think at any moment that he was going to be overawed. But, I guess his naivety was part of the fact that I knew that he was going to give his best. So, there wasn't a lot of people in the individual. Was there maybe 35 competitors? I can't really remember. There wasn't 100, I know that. So, I felt that if he was solid in all three phases, he would finish with a solid performance and a solid score. And, he did perform probably as well as I could have expected in the dressage. So he was, wasn't out of contention at that stage. And then he just, went well from there on in. So...
I
didn't really think I was going to win.
You didn't think you were going to win, but you had high hopes for him as a horse and as a young horse.
I think I was in the lead after cross country though. And,
so you were equal 15th after dressage.
Okay.
And then you went, let me just find it here because I've got it. So you were equal 15th after the dressage. Actually, Mary King William were out in front by a considerable margin. They were on a 31.6, which in today's money would be seriously low. Then you went out on the cross country and put in the fastest round of the day. There were only actually 2 combinations, yourself and Sally Clark, Squirrel Hill, also from New Zealand, who came in with single figure time penalties. But he absolutely climbed up the leaderboard to lead going into the show jumping. What were your thoughts going into that final show jumping? Because actually you're jumping for an Olympic gold medal, and he didn't have a fence in hand because Sally and Squirrel Hill had gone in clear. I think by this point there'd only been 3 clear rounds, so it was obviously a tough show jumping track.
I do remember being in the warm-up and knowing that Sally had gone clear, but I think mentally I was prepared for that because Sally's horse was a great show jumper, and she'd had a good track record at that particular point in time. So, but again, as I said, I probably, and whether it was naivety, but I had the utmost confidence in him. I do believe that of any of my horses, if I went into the show jumping ring expecting a clear round, it was on him. You could count on on one hand the number of fences he had done in his whole career, to be honest. And so, I just knew that I was going to have to jump clear, really. And, you don't very often get the chance to go for that opportunity, with fences in hand. So it's part of the whole, Olympics and championship thing is to be able to cope with the pressure. And, I think that really I was ready for it. So I just rode him like I would normally ride him, and he jumped clear.
He absolutely delivered. And actually he went on then 2 years later to take the world title in Rome as well. He became such a stalwart of your string. In terms of the New Zealand team, were they able to stay out there and help support you guys in the individual competition?
Yes, I think so. I recall that everyone was there. It didn't sort of feel incredibly different to be an individual to being in the team. It was just the New Zealand effort. All the personnel were the same, and the chef and vet and farrier and trainers and I think the fellow riders were still there, probably wearing their medals around their necks.
Probably just walking around with a bronze medal on. What is your lasting memory of Atlanta? We've mentioned obviously the build up and the I guess the concerns and the detail that had gone into the conditions. It was a massively successful games for you personally.
Yeah, my first experience was Barcelona, and that was very sort of razzmatazz and very sort of Spanish and quite sort of artistic. I think that the American one was typically American, the Atlanta one, where there was a lot of umpire and but it was really well presented, and the facilities were fantastic. The main arena and the stabling and the cross country, it was all just really impressive. I think my lasting impression of it was that it was a really happy experience for the Kiwis, because I went to Sydney 4 years later, and that was the opposite end of the scale, where everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong. But in Atlanta, my memory is obviously coming away with a gold medal, is that it was a really fun experience. I remember particularly standing on the podium when the national anthem played, and I was thinking, oh God, I should be reacting, I should be crying or something like that. And I just couldn't really feel anything, and it was because of just such relief that I hadn't lost the gold medal. And our sport takes 3 or 4 days to come to a result. It's not like a 100-meter sprint where it's over in a few seconds and you're either champion or not. So for me, but it's later on that you look back and you reflect on the successful campaign, and it's 4 years till the next Olympics, and that's then very satisfying and very rewarding. But the instant emotions, I think, in our sport aren't quite the same as they are in others. But I also remember thinking at the time that it doesn't happen on your own. It takes you groom is just as big a part. So are the trainers, so are your fellow teammates, so are the vets and everything like that. So even though I'd won an individual medal, it still felt very much like a team effort.
Like a team performance. Blyth, thank you so much. It was an incredibly happy games for you, and it has been lovely to relive some of those memories.
Thank you very much. Great to talk to you.
So there we have it, the story of Atlanta 1996, 25 years on, hearing from 5 people who all played a huge part in the games that I think we can say were a huge success, Dee. It was absolutely fascinating to look back and sort of find out more in more detail.
Yeah, lots of detail. And to be honest, we're still only scratching the surface. Like, I found myself reading about you find yourself going back to 1996 generally. And I'm not going to go into the British number ones of that year, Nicole. As you know, that's a favourite topic of mine. But just thinking about the actual games, like Muhammad Ali and Bill Clinton, I think, one doing the torch and the other opening them. The whole issue with the bombing at Atlanta 96, which is now a major motion picture, as they say. It's a whole film about it, but an incredible story as well behind that. There's so much in it, like even just 2 minutes on the Wikipedia page about Atlanta 1996, and you find yourself going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole. We've only been able to touch on some of the detail that that our 4 or 5 guests have been able to get for us, and what a treat that's been. So yeah, absolutely delighted with the little bit that we've been able to do. But to be honest, you could do about 5 or 6 more shows on Atlanta, and I think we'd still only be halfway there.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Catherine, we were looking through the guests and looking through the people that were there and involved, and we could have found a dozen people that we would have loved to have heard their story of Atlanta.
Definitely. What I'm thinking is it reminds me how incredible an Olympic Games is. It's different to other championships. It's different to other competitions. It's something so much bigger, and it stirs up, emotion to people, memories. This is when eventing really plays its part in the wider world of sport on a proper global stage. And it makes me really, really excited about Tokyo and really hope it's going to happen.
Yeah, it makes me very proud of eventing, actually. And the chance of displaying it on that world stage is exceptionally special. It was a very, very good games for the United States, with an individual medal and a team medal as well. And all eyes, as we've heard, were on the US team over in Atlanta. Listeners, we could talk about Atlanta, as we've said, for many, many, many hours, but we hope you have enjoyed a slightly longer than usual, more documentary style podcast looking back at the story of 1996. We will be planning to do a few more of these over the coming months. Not every month, every few months. If you've got any topics that you would like to put forward for suggestion, then by all means send them in at Eventing Podcast across any of our social media platforms. We would love to hear from you, and we will do our best. But we hope for now that you have enjoyed looking back on the story of 1996 Atlanta and the Olympic Games. A big, big thank you to both Derm and Catherine, but also to our 5 guests, to Hugh Thomas, Dr. David Marlin, Kate Green, Wendy Schaeffer Macdonald, and to Blyth Tait. And listeners, we hope you've enjoyed. We will be back very soon with another episode of the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast.